You want to go ahead and open your Bibles to Philippians 4th chapter. That's where my lesson will come from this evening. I do appreciate the presence of everyone. Hope you've enjoyed this beautiful Lord's Day. In a few minutes we'll stand and sing the song that Stanley has announced. And if you're not a Christian, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Or if you are but you haven't been living right, we hope you'll give some serious thought to correcting your life. But we are thankful for your presence this evening. Most people know that the Bible states that God is the one who created man. And one of the things that He did when He created mankind is He gave mankind the ability to think. That's one of the things that makes man superior to animals. Now, sometimes people will think animals can think, but really they can be taught things, but they function on instinct. They cannot reason like mankind does. And not only did God give us the power to think, He gave us the ability to control what we think. Right now, you can choose to think on anything you want to think about while you're here tonight. And when you leave here, you can think on noble things and good things. Or if you want to, you can think on what the world calls worldly things and filth and things that will corrupt your mind. God lets you choose that. And here in Philippians 4, Paul really gives 6 virtues that he tells us basically that we need to think about. And we're going to list them and then talk about some things. But it begins down there in verse 8. He says, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise," he says, think on these things. And in verse 9, we're told, "Those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me do, and the God of peace shall be with you." Now, Paul, if you'll notice in this verse, back in verse 8, when he said, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever," he didn't use the word some things. Finally, some things that we're to think on. He used the term whatsoever. Some translations just merely state whatever, which suggests to us that we're to think on all things that encompass these 6 virtues that he lists. First one that he talks about is whatsoever things are true. And if you look that up, most know what is true. It means true, loving, the truth, speaking the truth, truthful. Then it says whatsoever things are honest. Your version may say noble. It means noble or honorable. And if you take the first 2 together, it really talks about, these 2 have to do with a Christian being noble and honest with God, himself, and other people. Because if we're not truthful and honest with God, and if we're not truthful and honest with ourselves, you can pretty much assure you're not going to be that way with other people. And we do this, when this is done, you wonder sometimes how people develop what's known as a reputation, a good name. Well, it's because of these 2 things that Paul states. Because of your thinking on things that are true and honorable and noble, it affects the decisions you make and how you live and how you treat other people. And you'll get a good name and you'll be well spoken of. But you'll look at the third thing he mentions. He says, whatsoever things are just. Now that simply means what is right. It could be virtuous, keeping the commands of God, or something that is upright. In other words, a Christian does what is right towards his fellow man, but also towards God. And again, Over and over, the Bible talks about the importance of loving God and loving our fellow man. And then the fourth one is whatsoever things are pure. In other words, free from carnalities. Some render that modest, chaste. Remember, he's stating these virtues that we're to think upon. And when a Christian thinks on things that are pure, it kind of ties in to what Jesus said in the Beatitudes, doesn't it? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And when one is following the Bible and adding to their life the fruit of the Spirit, they're going to live a holy and godly life. You're going to be pure. The fifth one, he states, whatsoever things are lovely. Interesting word. Means pleasing, agreeable, lovely. In other words, a Christian is to be so pleasing and agreeable to those that they come in contact with that what happens is they bring out the good in the people they're touching in their lives. They draw out the love out of that person. He's saying we should think on things that are lovely. And the sixth one, he says, and whatsoever things are of good report. In other words, commendable, admirable. Now, since we're following and being led as Christians, as we should, by the Spirit, and we're manifesting the fruit of the Spirit in our life and the Christian graces, your reputation, as we talked about earlier, things of good report, they're going to tie in to how you live. And see, it's very important because you say, look down at the verse 8 there, at the last part of verse 8. After he lists these 6 things, he says, think on these things. Vine says that word think signifies something. He says it signifies make those things the subject of your thoughtful consideration or carefully reflect on them. And I've stated before, what you think can change your attitude. How you start your day on what you're listening to changes your attitude. And I did a simple test years ago. I had an hour drive to work and an hour back. And instead of listening to the country music where everybody's dog died and their wife ran off and they lost their truck, I decided that I would listen to, I think it was 96.3 oldies coming out of Murfreesboro. Well, everything on that station was upbeat and happy. I noticed that my attitude changed. Then I started listening to sermon tapes on the way for that hour. See, we need to remember it's important. And the wise man states this. Remember Proverbs? What we think is so important. Proverbs 4, let me read 2 verses. Verse 23 first, we're told, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. And in Proverbs 23:7a, or the first part of that verse, we're told, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. And that's true. If someone is constantly telling you that you're no good, you're never going to amount to anything, I'm talking about when you're little, growing up, you never do anything right, that is going to have an impact on you. Versus someone telling you you can do anything you want to in the world. Now, like most parents, my parents told us that. And I always had a problem with that because I thought, well, what if I wanted to be an astronaut or be in the Olympics? I might not be able to make it. But what they were trying to do was instill in me to think on things and build self-esteem, because it's very important. When you look at these 6 virtues, he who thinks on those things that are true becomes true. He who thinks on those things that are just becomes just. He who thinks on those things that are pure becomes pure. See, and you could go on and on. But go to verse 9 with me. Because if we want to do the will of God, you have to think on the will of God. And after Paul lists these 6 virtues, the result he gives us in verse 9. He states, or he exhorts, those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me. Did he notice he doesn't say admire or praise, does he? Think on it. He doesn't say that. He says, which ye have both learned and received and heard in me, he says, do. And then it says, and the God of peace shall be with you. Paul said, do them. See, what I do is a direct result of what I think. And most of us understand that simple principle, and yet we forget it so often. Sometimes people will wonder, why does someone act a certain way? Well, it's directly correlated to the way they think. Thinking and doing. That's what Paul, through the Spirit, is teaching us. Now, if you go to Philippians 2, you might ask the question, well, what did Paul teach Christians to do? Because you remember in verse 9, after he lists these 6 virtues, he said, those things which you've learned, received, and heard, and seen in me, do. Well, Philippians 2:12, notice this verse. Paul's taught here, he said, wherefore, my beloved brethren, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, he says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. You ever wondered why would Paul tell us to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling? We learn some things from this. You'll notice there, the King James renders it, work out your own. That emphasizes what Brother Carl taught about 2 Wednesdays ago in Ezekiel. Personal responsibility. Each Christian has the personal responsibility to work out their own salvation. Now, when you look at this verse, it says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Work out really means complete. We know what own, it's my responsibility, but working out means complete. Vine says, this is to carry out to the goal or completion. You say, well, wait a minute, I obey the gospel. The Bible says when I'm raised from the waters of baptism, God forgives me of my sins. And it does. But what Paul is saying here, you now have the personal responsibility to carry that out. What's the goal? What's the complete goal? Heaven, what we talked about this morning. In other words, we must continue to live faithfully and live as God says, which is directly linked to our text tonight on what we allow ourselves to think. So, once you're saved, you're just not always saved. You have to bring it to fruition. You have to completely continue to live for God. You say, well, what does it entail to work out and complete and bring that to its ultimate goal? What does that involve? What's a Christian look like that does that? If you go to Galatians 5 with me, I'm going to notice a few things real quick. One is, as a Christian, you're constantly crucifying your flesh and the passions and lust. Here in verse 24, it says, and they that are Christ have crucified the flesh with affections and lusts. Sometimes we read that and we think that's a one-time deal. I obeyed the gospel and I put it all behind me and I'm not going to do that anymore. And then 6 months down the road, you got a problem. It's an ongoing process. That's what we talked about in Philippians 2:12. You're working out your salvation. Because the devil, as we know, even though we may overcome him today, he's going to find another way to get to us, isn't he? He's always going to be after us. So if this kind of life is, you're constantly crucifying your flesh. looking for weaknesses that you have. If you look in Hebrews 12, 2 verses there, 14 and 15, a life that is doing what Paul says, you'll be following peace and you'll be living a holy life and striving not to fall short of God's grace. That's what the Hebrew writer says. Look at Hebrews 12, 14 and 15. He says, follow peace with all men, and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. Looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and hereby or thereby many be defiled. It's not easy to live a holy life with all the temptations and things that are thrown at us today. That's why we have to constantly crucify our flesh. Third thing, you got to put off the old man and put on the new. Again, it's not a one-time thing. Ephesians 4, if you look there real quick, and you go down to verse 22. Here again, Paul mentions this. He states, that ye put off concerning the former conversation, in other words, your way of life, the old man which is corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Verse 24, he says, and that ye put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. We're accustomed to putting on things. I put on my coat before I came over to the building. We put on our clothes every day. The other day I'm driving down the road and it started to sprinkle and my right windshield wiper blade just snapped. Well, I had to put on new windshield wiper blades. We understand the concept of putting things on. Galatians 3, 26-27 talks about when we obey the gospel, we put on Christ in baptism. But just like I can take things off in the world, I can put off the new man if I choose to. And you can too. I can say, I'm not going to live like this. I'm going to go like my neighbor when I was driving over here. He was out in his yard. It's a good time to mow the yard today. And he's not worshiping God. I saw another fellow this morning on the way over here weeding in a ditch, and he had a long way to go. It was one of those steep ditches. And see, we put off things. Paul talks about here, you have to put off the old man. Again, it's tied into what we think. And one last thing, Ephesians 6, 11 and verse 13 as well. You have to put on the whole armor of God. God equips us. Here in these two verses, he says, put on the whole armor of God that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Go down to verse 13. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand. Now remember what Paul said in verse 9. He told them after he said to think on these things, he stated, those things which ye have learned and received and heard and seen in me do. Paul practiced what he preached, and that is very important in each of our lives. I was told years ago that whether you know it or not, someone is always looking at you. Always. Hunters know that usually if you're deer hunting and you see one deer, there's probably 4 that you don't see that are looking at you. Someone is watching your actions last week, and they'll be watching you this week. They'll be watching me. Paul, real quick, what did they see in Paul? We won't read the verses for time's sake, but if you look at the life of Paul, you can't deny that although he was telling these people to think on these things, he no doubt thought on these very same virtues. And it was manifested by the fruit he bore. Example, he was an example in suffering. Just read 2 Corinthians 11 when you get a chance. verses 24 through 28. Look what that man went through. Did you know they just made a movie about the Apostle Paul? I watched the preview. I didn't rent it, but I just watched the preview. Do you know Paul was bald? First thing I noticed, they got him bald. But they're making a lot of religious movies about biblical characters. They came out with one about Samson again. It's hard to beat the original Samson with Victor McClure. If you remember, you ever saw that movie? That was a good movie. But they've come out with one on Paul. Paul was an example. And just watching the preview, it's kind of like watching The Passion of Christ that Mel Gibson made. I can read things, but seeing it, visualizing what Jesus went through, and Mel Gibson went in great detail to try to show us that. It's terrible to watch. And when you watch this, what they did about Paul, and how he had to flee, what he had done to others, as Brother Johnny's been teaching, people were now trying to do to him. But he was an example in suffering. He was an example of determination. Philippians 3, 13 and 14. He forgot those things that were behind him, and he just went on. He pressed forward. And then another example, he was an example of contentment. In Philippians 4:11, remember he said, "Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content." So when Paul goes back here and he's telling these people about these 6 virtues and what to think on, and then he tells them, oftentimes parents will say, "Do as I say, don't do as I do." Paul didn't say that. He told someone. He's telling these people. He's telling us. And I wonder, could we do that this week to someone? Do what you see me do. Live like you see me live. Do we have that kind of Christian life? Paul did. In fact, he had no regrets, because one last verse, when he came to the close of his life, in 2 Timothy 4, he wrote this to Timothy in verse 6 through 7. He said, "For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand." And then he states, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith." He never gave up. Never gave up. It's important about these virtues is because what we think about is what we do. So tonight, if you're living on your fleshly side, more than likely you're thinking on your fleshly side. I got curious. Sister Linda back there does a good job on the website. And you can click on the website and go to sermons. But then after you click the sermon, you can go down there and click YouTube. We have a YouTube page. And I was curious. I'd seen it on other sites. When it brings up the sermons, you can click all the way over, and on the right side, you can do it by date or you can do it by most popular. And I thought, well, I wonder which one of my poor sermons these poor people are listening to the most. And you know which one has been seen or listened to the most? Pornography. Pornography. Oh, the one I preached years ago on pornography, if I'm not mistaken, it's had thousands of hits. That tells me something. That tells me something. People are struggling, battling to control their minds, and they're trying to do what's right. Tonight, if you're not thinking as you should, you need to get your mind set on spiritual things. You need to get right with God. And you need to start living as God would have you to. And your life will change. Problems won't mysteriously go away, but they won't be near as bad as they used to be because they're not as important as they used to be. You're going to a better place. Tonight, as Brother Stanley leads us in this song, I hope all of us as Christians are heeding Paul's advice. And if you're not, you need to make any corrections, we invite you at this time to do just that.